Hello everyone, welcome back to Relax with Animal Facts. I am Steph Wolf, and today I'm going to be learning with you about our furry, scaly, or possibly even slimy friends. And in today's case, it is absolutely a slimy friend, finally. I don't know how many slimy friends we've done on the show already, but it is most oftentimes a furry one as of recent episodes. So I'm very happy to be doing a slimy friend today, which is the oh so wonderful Snail. And this is a very, very special listener episode dedicated to Emmy, who wrote into the show. Emmy was the special listener mail of last week's Wolverine episode. So thank you, Emmy. Without you, this episode would not be possible. And thank you to all of you who continue to send me suggestions. So before we get into the show, I'm just going to go over a few things. The first thing being that thank you to all of you who listen on Spotify and follow the show. We're going to be having a special episode next week for 500 Spotify followers. So it is going to be 2 animals in one podcast as a special thank you to all of you out there who follow and listen on Spotify. Now, to any of you that are listening through Apple Podcasts, I am going to be reading reviews every week on the show. So for those of you listening through Apple Podcasts, I encourage you to rate the show 5 stars and write a review, because it really helps the show reach some more people that would love to relax with animal facts. And it also, you can also have a chance of being featured on the show. So I'm going to be reading reviews every week. So thank you to all of you for all your support. And why don't we just get right into the show? So today's facts are coming from snail-world.com. So that is a very good website, Snail World. And then also from mentalfloss.com, a website that we've used many times on the show. Now, the Snail has so much information on it, so many facts. Snail World was very abundant in facts. So we have so many to get through. So I'm going to try not to take as much time on each one, because it'll end up being like 50 minutes to an hour if I don't pace myself properly. So anyways, let's just start with the first fact. So snails are gastropod mollusks, which are members of the phylum Mollusca, which is spelled Mollusca, and the class Gastropoda. And there may be as many as 150,000 species of gastropods, not of snails specifically, but of gastropods, so of the class Gastropoda. And they live in almost all habitats, ranging from deep ocean trenches to even places like deserts. So the Gastropoda class covers a very wide range and diverse sort of habitat group, I suppose you could say. So this is a fairly common fact, and it is when they feel threatened, they will usually retreat into their shell to protect themselves. So this is also seen in larger animals such as the turtle, right? So the turtle also likes to go into their shells to protect themselves, and that's part of having that shell, is having that protective mechanism, because these traditional snails don't really have that good a form of evasive maneuvering or sort of defense mechanisms. So going into their shell is going to be their primary way of protecting themselves. And you have probably seen this before, where if you sort of tap a snail, I don't recommend you necessarily do this, but as kids, I'm sure all of us were sort of curious in that way, and maybe tapped a snail or picked a snail up. They always go back into their shell, because that is their safe sort of their safest place that they could be. So if you're wondering about what is the largest land snail, the giant African snail is going to take the gold medal on that one, with the scientific name Achatina achatina. So that is pretty cool. So there's a giant African snail, which is the largest land snail of all of them. So we're going to give big credits and props to that giant African snail. And snails don't actually have a backbone, which is super interesting. So their anatomical structure, physiological structure, is going to be very, different from humans, obviously. So I just think that's very cool. And some land snails will feed on other terrestrial snails. So this is very common in many species for them to eat different members of their species. It is not something exclusive to snails by a long shot. So they will indeed feed on other terrestrial snails. And North America has about 500 native species of land snails. And that word native just meaning that it is where they're coming from. So North America, that is where they always were. It is not as if they were, transported by ship or something to North America, as a sort of, they're known as foreign species or alien species of certain animals. We've seen that with fish and stuff like that, where they might be deemed invasive species. But in North America, there are 500 native species of land snails that were just here. And the snails that just hatch the egg can eat their shells and even other eggs of their brothers. So snails can be quite brutal, which is something that this is complete news to me, something I have never heard of before. But they will even eat eggs of their brothers. These guys can be absolutely ruthless when they're just babies. And most snails live from about 2 to 5 years, which is actually longer than what I would have guessed it would be. My guess of snail lifespan would have been somewhere in the year range, within a year, but they can actually live up to 5 years. But in captivity, some have exceeded 10 or 15 years of age. So 15 years of age for the size and structure of a snail, that is fairly impressive, even in captivity, where we know that animals generally have a much longer life expectancy and lifespan. So I just think that's awesome. And quickly, we're going to talk about the term escargot, one I'm sure that many of you have heard before. So snails are indeed edible, and in France, this is where it kind of originated. They named it escargot, and that is sort of the word for a dish made with snail, which is considered to be an appetizer. But regardless, we're not talking, we generally don't talk too much about how the animals sort of relate to food and stuff like that. But just because escargot might be something that people have heard before, but not know where that word comes from or what it really means. So it's just a dish that is made with snails, very popular in France, and is considered a delicacy. So I guess still, credit to where credit is due, snails. And the courtship process by which they will attract each other before mating, I always love learning about these because they're almost always unique to the species. Their courtship will last between 2 and 12 hours. So that courtship process is very long, and one that I wouldn't have imagined to be that long for, again, the snails of this size, and also snails of their of their functioning, how fast they move, things like that. Whenever I think of a snail, I always think slow and whatnot. So maybe their slowness has to do with how long their courtship is, of up to 12 hours. I would think that they would want to keep their courtship somewhat brief, because them being so slow, I would think each of them would be like, okay, we both got things to do, we both got things to eat, why don't we just speed this up a little bit, or put the courtship dance, not the courtship dance necessarily, but the courtship process down a little bit. But I suppose that some of them don't mind spending 12 hours during the courtship process. They actually hatch from eggs. So just like we covered before how snails will oftentimes eat the eggs of their brothers, so they do come from eggs. And the mucus of the garden snail has been used to treat wrinkles, scars, and spots on the skin. So I suppose the cosmetic industry has used this in the past. I am not in any way an expert on the cosmetic industry, so I can't speak too much to this. But I don't have wrinkles yet, but I suppose when I do, I have snails in my backyard and figure something out. And most snails are hermaphrodites, which means that they have both female and male reproductive organs. And this is not something that is exclusive to the snail. There are indeed other species with both female and male reproductive organs. So that's amazing. And the speed of the snail, which is one of the main things that are attributed to snails, them being slow, it's about half an inch to 0.8 inches per second. So if they move without stopping, it would take more than a week to complete 1 kilometer, somewhat similar to maybe what I would do. I'm just kidding. I don't think it would take me a week to complete a kilometer, but the point is that these snails can be fairly slow. They like to take their time, which is why I found it so surprising that their courtship process could last up to 12 hours. So land snails cover the entrance of their shell with a dry mucus secretion called here we go with these words again, epiphragm. It's spelled sort of like diaphragm with the GM ending, so I believe it's epiphragm. But a few do it with a structure that in the aquatic snails has the name of the operculum. So I had no idea this was a thing, but they do indeed cover the entrance with their shell with this dry mucus secretion. And snails do not change the shells when they grow up. Instead, the shell will grow along with them, rather than what I certainly imagined that they would, whenever their shell gets damaged or something, that they leave the shell and then find a new one. And it is something that is common among many sort of water-dwelling creatures, but I suppose not with the land snails. So some predators of terrestrial snails, so snails are not thought of as apex predators because they're not, but some predators of terrestrial snails are going to be beetles, rats, mice, turtles, salamanders, and some birds as well. So unfortunately, they have a lot of animals to worry about when it comes to them being prey to. So not so good for the snails. But in there, I suppose, wasn't written humans, because oftentimes I suppose humans are considered predators to almost every other species on Earth. So I guess it's kind of redundant to say humans. So calcium carbonate is the main component of the snail shell. So calcium carbonate, for those of you that are studying chemistry out there, I have some background in chemistry. So for those of you that are taking chemistry maybe in high school or in university, college, there you go. Now you have something to tell your chemistry teachers or professors. Snail shells are made mostly of calcium carbonate. So snails will host several types of parasites, unfortunately for them. While may not kill them, they are capable of affecting or killing the predators or animals that then eat the snails. And humans who could indulge in escargot, as we covered earlier, if it is poorly cooked snail or something like that, it can actually result in you becoming very seriously ill. So whenever you do have escargot, maybe don't do it yourself at home. If you are going to try this delicacy, maybe it is best to get it professionally made and so it is safe to eat. And the only measurable difference between snails and slugs is that the former, meaning the snails, have a shell. So the snail and the slug are exactly the same, but the slugs do not have the shell on their back. So it's a cool fact, and one that I think is more common. I'm sure many of you already knew that, but regardless, for those of you that didn't know that, there you go. So the food of land snails goes through a mouth structure called the radula. I think it's the radula, which has several rows of tiny little teeth inside. So I always like learning anatomical terms for different sort of animals because they have very different anatomical structure. So their mouth structure is called the radula, okay? And they do indeed have teeth, but very, very tiny teeth spread along several rows. So this will lead them to, unfortunately, not be able to chew their food. They instead do a process of mechanical digestion, meaning in the mouth, they scrap it. So they refer to it as not chewing, but instead scrapping it. And if you wonder about how land snails breathe, they do breathe thanks to a singular lung. So here it is written that they do indeed have not lungs, plural, but lung, singular. So I never even thought about that, but they do indeed have a lung. So a single garden snail, which has the scientific name of Helix aspera, helix, I'm sure, referring to the shape of the shell, they can have up to 430 hatchlings after just a year. So one single snail can have up to 430 offspring. I'm not sure what the percentages of viability among those offspring. Viability, I just am referring to in the animal kingdom. Viability means the offspring, sort of what is the likelihood that the offspring will survive and have offspring of its own, because the measure of viability in wild animals has to do specifically with offspring and its ability to produce its own, because that is what carries on the genetic code and allows these snails to fulfill their, I suppose, purpose, I guess you could say. So the size of the shell of a snail can reflect its age. So sort of, that's an interesting thing, how we've covered animals where sometimes they'll have rings, somewhere on their body, to almost like a tree, to see, what the age is. But in this case, it is just the size of the shell is relative to the age of the snail. And this is a somewhat valuable characteristic, or one that makes sense, because as we covered before, snails don't leave their shell and find a new one. If that was the case, the size of the shell wouldn't necessarily reflect its age, because, a fairly young snail, if they found a shell that was big, it wouldn't really make sense scientifically to classify them in this way. So many snails are indeed in danger of extinction. So not so good. Among these are the species of Adonta constricta and Adonta, this is a tough one, fuscosonata. These are made just to throw me off, I swear. And others of the genus Adonta and Achatinella are in danger of extinction as well. So this is most likely due to things such as habitat loss and different sorts of things, to human not intervention, but human presence. Because it can really have an effect on these guys. And researchers from Boston Children's Hospital and MIT have developed an adhesive that mimics the stickiness of a slug's slime, the same gel that allows marine snails to be able to cling to rocks, in the surf, just meaning fast sort of moving water. And the medical glue is designed for use in repairing heart defects and would stick to even jagged surfaces where traditional sutures might leak. And so far it has only been tested on pig hearts, but this is something that I think is truly, truly amazing, and why it is so, it can be so valuable to study animals and to understand them. And it's part of the reason why I do this podcast, not only for those of you to sort of take a load off, because all of you work hard and you deserve to take a load off once in a while, but also because I just find it so absolutely interesting that human beings can take lessons and biological mechanisms from animals and apply it in our daily lives to make our lives better and whatnot. So animals just serve such an amazing purpose to us humans. And the sea snail was considered a symbol of rebirth and joy for the Mesoamericans, who believed the whorl, the sort of whorl shape of the shell represented even the circle of life. So I think that's just very cool. And now we're just going to go to some additional facts that we have. Some snails hibernate, which means that some species of snail will hibernate during the colder months of the year. Hibernation meaning that during the colder months of the year, they are sleeping for long periods of time. They will cover their bodies with a thin layer of mucus, which prevents them from drying out. So super, super important. And sometimes snails also do a similar process in the summertime, which is not called hibernation, but instead known as estivation, to survive if it is a dry sort of period. And these processes are probably one of the reasons they have survived for such a long time. It is in the millions of years range. So obviously they are doing something right. So with land snails, when they move, we've seen in cartoons and things like that, SpongeBob, Gary, where snails leave behind this trail of mucus. Now this mucus is indeed very important because it will act as a lubricant to reduce friction against the surface where they pass. So it really helps them move more fluidly and reduce risk of any sort of injury or anything like that. Now, it takes them a week to move about 1 kilometer. So if you could imagine having more friction, if they didn't have the mucus, it might take them forever to be able to traverse that amount of distance. So snails can see, but they can't hear. So most land snails have 2 sets of tentacles, the upper one carrying the eyes, while the lower one has the olfactory organs. So olfactory refers to the ability to smell, but they don't have ears or ear canals, meaning that they cannot hear, but they can indeed see and smell. And snails are nocturnal. So they are nocturnal animals, which means that most of their activities will take place at night. This is because snails generally do not like the sunlight very much, which is why you might find them out on more cloudy days. But if you keep them in an aquarium, make sure there is not too much sunlight in the room, or the snails will sometimes stop eating and hide inside their shell. So, if you're wondering why you see them mostly on cloudy days, it is because they don't like sunshine too much. Unlike a lot of us humans, I particularly love sunshine, and I'm very happy that as of recently in Canada, we've been having some very nice weather. So this is something that has been seen in media as well, and things that I think I've seen other kids do when I was growing up. Snails will die if you put salt on them. So this is sort of a chemical thing that they can't withstand. Make sure they don't get in contact with salt if you have one in captivity, just because their body can't process it, and they will die fairly quickly and dry out just because of how salt works chemically. So the giant African land snail is known to eat more than 500 different types of plants. So if you remember from the beginning of the episode, the giant African land snail is indeed the largest land snail that we currently know of. And although these guys are small, they are not very weak. So snails can lift up to 10 times their body weight when in a vertical position. So that is something I would definitely not have expected. I imagine them to be a little bit on the weaker side, but that is why we don't make assumptions about the animals we learn on this podcast, because they always they can blow you out of the water and surprise you. And now we're going to move on to the final fact of the episode, which always has something to do with the name. Now, I couldn't find a story, I couldn't find anything like that. I only could find the scientific name for the snail, just because snails have been around for millions of years. I couldn't find anything to do with, the first person to discover a snail or anything like that. But their scientific name, so those of you listening, try not to laugh here, it is Actinoidea. Very long name that are made, and these scientific words are made specifically to trip Steph Wolf up. So that is the scientific name. I'm not even going to try again. So unfortunately, I couldn't find too much in terms of a story or anything like that, but still, that scientific name is rather cool. And so now we're going to move on to the new segment of the show, which is listener mail. So to any of you out there that write into the show, I always love to read your mail if it's something nice or if you want me to read it. So this listener mail is from Shannon, and Shannon writes, "Hi Steph, I love listening to your podcasts and your uniquely soothing voice." Thank you very much. As a person who used to own 22 rats at one time, I would love to hear a podcast episode about them. I have 2 at the moment called Joey and Chandler, in brackets Shannon writes, care to guess who I named them after? I have no idea. That's a tough one. Rats have such a bad reputation that but there is so much more to them than being pests that carry diseases. They are so intelligent and adaptable, and I bet they will outlive us humans. I already know so much about them, but I would love to hear an episode dedicated to them anyway and educate the listeners at how incredible they really are. I would love to be mentioned on your podcasts. From Shannon. So Shannon, thank you so much for your listener mail. I think that's amazing that you used to own 22 rats at one time. So you are definitely an authority when it comes on the subject of rats. And I think that is an amazing idea. Rats, to me, have always had that stigma of being, not so good, not so friendly. Same thing with the diseases and things like that. So I think it would be amazing to learn more about them. And I think that the majority of the Relax with Animal Facts podcast family would love to learn about them as well. So definitely when I do the rat episode, I'm sure I'm going to get an email or 2 from you about maybe how I got something wrong or pronounced something wrong or whatever. So I definitely look forward to that. So thank you all so very much for tuning into the show. If you want to hear your animal on the podcast, make sure to write me an email at relaxwithanimalfacts@gmail.com. Make sure to follow the Instagram at RWAF Podcast. There I'm posting, if you want to see where I record my podcasts from, it's fairly funny, and different sorts of things like that. Updates, if you would like to see the biggest fan of the podcast, my dog Molly, you can head over to that Instagram, and I look forward to seeing all of you there. So thank you all so very much for listening to the show, and I will see you on the next podcast episode with the next animal. Take care.